So you apply all of those ideas to the Middle East, and you start saying, well, all Israelis are white, they're colonizers, and therefore any form of resistance to them must be justified. I think we've seen over the last decade something quite remarkable, which is the rise of a genuinely new ideology. The nature of what it means to be on the left has significantly changed for many people, from a moral universalism, from an emphasis on the idea that we can understand, be in conversation with people who are very different from us, but we can build political solidarity on the basis of common interests, often on the basis of economic interests. We've seen the rise of an ideology that denies many of those things, that sees the world through the prism of the role that identity categories do and should play in the world. And that says that if you stand at a different intersection of identities to me, then perhaps I can't understand you. That rather than building a mutual understanding of the world and acting on basis of that, I should defer to you, because I'm never truly going to be able to understand you. And so political solidarity needs to consist in deferring to the views, to the preferences of other groups. That therefore, rather than encouraging pupils in school, for example, to see what they have in common across different lines, we should encourage them in the words of one very influential organization in the United States, to see themselves as racial beings. We should run these segregated affinity groups that really encourage people to see themselves primarily in terms of the kind of group into which they are born.
Can you give us some examples of where this sort of thing can be seen, sort of in the wild, in the real world, as if it were, rather than just in sort of theoretical academic circles?
Yeah, so we see it a lot these days in social media and in the legacy media, but especially in the United States, we've also seen it influence everything from pedagogical practices to government policy. I'll give you two examples. The first is that, as I was alluding to a moment ago, there are now many schools in the United States that have racially segregated affinity groups. And we're not talking here about 15, 16, 17-year-olds opting into some kind of club. We're talking about teachers coming into classrooms when children are 8 or 7 or 6 and telling them the black kids are going to go into that classroom, and the Asian American kids are going to go into a second classroom, the Latino kids are going to go into a third classroom, and the white kids are going to go into a fourth classroom. And the idea, the hope here, which is understandable insofar as it goes, is to encourage these kids from minority communities to embrace their identity and to use that as a kind of locus of political resistance, as a way of fighting back against the injustices that certainly to some extent they do experience. I think this is a big mistake, because everything that we know from history and from social science teaches us that human beings are groupish. We tend to identify in terms of groups and to advantage the in-group over the out-group. And when we do that, we can become really cruel and violent towards the out-group. So the idea of these white kids in particular are going to sort of recognize the white privilege and become great, anti-racist activists, I think is naive. If you're teaching these young kids that the most important thing about them is that they are white, it is much more likely that they actually turn to white supremacists and to people who fight for the interests of whites.
You wrote in the Times recently about how this the perspective this gave us on the conflict in Israel and Gaza, and the way that conflict was being perceived in the West and elsewhere. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so one of the strange things about this ideology is that it tries to squeeze all kinds of world conflicts, all kinds of developments in the world into a relatively simplistic set of categories. So one of the core ways that this ideology perceives the world is that it splits the world into whites on the one side and so-called people of color in the other side. That is its perception of the main fault lines of history and the main fault lines of contemporary societies from the United Kingdom to the United States today. The second kind of prism is between colonizers and colonized. So it takes the experience of America or of Australia and it tries to look at other parts of the world through that same prism. And then third and finally, it has a very different conception of racism than the one we've traditionally had. So rather than thinking of racism as first-person beliefs that people hold, right? I'm a racist if I think that that group over there is somehow bad or inferior or immoral or stupid or something like that. it has an exclusively structural understanding of racism. So racism can persist even when nobody in a first personal way has those bigoted views. And because it's only structural, it means that actually if somebody has hatred towards the members of a supposedly privileged group, that doesn't count as racist, and perhaps it's even justified. And so you apply all of those ideas to the Middle East, and you start saying, well, all Israelis are white, they're colonizers, and therefore any form of resistance to them must be justified. And you end up not understanding the nature of the situation there. The fact that Ashkenazi Jews who come from Europe certainly were not white enough to be saved from the Holocaust. They certainly were looked at as racial others by the Nazis. But more importantly, a plurality of Jews in Israel today are Mizrahi Jews. And those Mizrahi Jews are not in any obvious way racially distinct. Certainly, they're not in any obvious ways more light-skinned than are Palestinians. You look at everybody as a colonizer, even though, going back again to Mizrahi Jews, these are people who've been thrown out of Middle Eastern countries over the course of the last 75 years. They used to live in places like Iraq and Iran and Morocco and Algeria and had nowhere else to go. No other country would take them in when they were expelled violently from those countries. And finally, you end up justifying the slaughter of babies and grandmothers, the slaughter of civilians, because supposedly they're these white colonizers, and so nothing that's done to them can be wrong, and nothing that's done to them can be racist.
Is this the identity trap in the way you talk about it? Is it a trap only for the left, or is it reflected on the right in a different form as well?
Well, what's going on the right is less surprising, which is to say that the right has had a form of identity politics and has a form of ethnic majoritarianism for a very long time. I think what the nature of a trap on the left is that they somehow have emulated many of those ideas, embraced many of those same ideas, but have convinced themselves that this is somehow in the service of some great progressive cause. So, it is more of a trap because it is deluded as to the nature of its own ideas. So let me say two things about this. One, cultural appropriation is a great example of that. The right has always been worried about cultural purity. When you go back to the 18th and 19th century, somebody like Richard Wagner, for example, he was always worried about the influence that outside forces from the French to Jews might have on German culture, right? This is a traditional set of right-wing concerns. What's very strange now is that in the name of social justice, in the name of social progress, you have strangely similar concerns on the left, saying that if the members of one group are influenced by the culture of another group, that is somehow inappropriate. So here I think you see that that similarity is a little bit more hidden, and that makes it more of a trap. And the second thing I'll say is that I'm very concerned, and I've been very concerned in much of my work over the last 10 years about the threat of right-wing populism. And so I've heard the question from well-meaning friends and interviewers in the last months, if Donald Trump continues to be a real contender for the 2024 presidential elections, shouldn't we be focusing all on that? Isn't that much more dangerous? Now, I disagree with that for two reasons. The first is that some of these ideas on the left are themselves quite damaging. I think those pedagogical practices we were talking about are not going to make the world a better place. But secondly, I think it's politically and strategically not very smart. One of the reasons why Donald Trump is running head-to-head with Joe Biden in 2024 is precisely because more Americans now think that the Democratic Party is too extreme than think that the Republican Party is too extreme. I don't agree with them on that, but that is how Americans perceive this. The fact that they no longer trust mainstream institutions, that they worry about the kinds of ideas and norms that are being embraced in the local school and by organizations like the Centers for Disease Control, is a big part of the reason why right-wing populists are doing so well. And so I'm telling American audiences these days that they can learn from the United Kingdom. I know Britain is not thinking very positively of itself at the moment, but I think Keir Starmer shows that when you cut off the left of the political party, when you distance yourself from those ideas, you wind up 20 points ahead in the polls. I really wish that Joe Biden took that lesson from the British Labour Party.
Turning to the UK then a little bit, we've seen in the last half decade or so the rise of quite a few non-white politicians on the British right. We have Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, but Suella Braverman, until recently being the Home Secretary, is a great example. And people like Suella Braverman, they don't seem to benefit from the sort of things that you're talking about on the left that exist. People on the left seem to have been quite happy to call Suella Braverman racist, no matter that she's a woman of Indian heritage. What's going on there, where these supposed beliefs that, as you say, are so deep-seated and have become so established on the left don't extend to political figures on the other side of the political spectrum in their conception?
Yeah, one of the things that I write about in the book, in The Identity Trap, is this idea formulated most poignantly, I think, by Anna Presley, a member of a squad of the sort of far-left contingent of the Democratic Party in Congress, that we don't want any black politicians who are not a black voice. We don't want any brown politicians who are not a brown voice. We don't want any queer politicians who are not a queer voice. So the idea here is that there's the right kind of standpoint to have as a member of a particular minority group. And that standpoint is, of course, supposed to be to believe in the identity synthesis, to believe in the kinds of ideas that I'm explaining in the book. And if you don't, then you are a traitor.